Hi, I'm Dan Voss, and for the next few minutes I'm going to discuss the Medicare Overpayment recovery process, which many people refer to as the Medicare take-back process. Our goals for this presentation are, first off, to give you a better understanding of the overpayment recovery process, and then to provide an understanding of how that Medicare recovery process is implemented in Billing's Remittance Processing module. And finally then to provide some tips for balancing your daily deposits when using remittance processing. Before we delve too far into the process of overpayment recovery, we have to come to terms on a few different terms. Now, we may all think that, well, we know all of the terms that they could be related to overpayment recovery, but sometimes terms get mixed up. So let's just get clear on a few of them. The first term I want to clarify is remittance. Now, in the course of this, we might talk about remittance files. You might hear about remittance transactions. Some people might refer to remittance a variety of different ways, maybe to mean a payment. But in reality, remittance is the sending of money to someone. When we say, if someone says that a remittance is a payment, well, that's assuming the reason for the remittance. And we don't really know, if we just refer to a remittance, what the reason for the transfer of money is, but we do know that remittance represents the transfer of money or the sending of money to someone. A payment, on the other hand, may be part of a remittance, but a payment is something that's given in return for a service or for goods, or may even be given in return for punishment or for reward. So payment and remittance closely related, but not exactly the same thing. The next term, provider level adjustment. Now, this is a term that you will hear many times related to a remittance transaction or remittance file that you receive from a healthcare payer. A provider level of adjustment is an adjustment to a remittance, so an adjustment to the amount of money being sent to someone that's not directly related to a specific claim or service. So it's an adjustment to the amount of money being sent that doesn't directly affect the amount of money being paid. Confused yet? Well, we'll try to clarify that in a few more moments. The fourth term is recovery. Now, recovery is the Medicare process for reallocating money that was paid incorrectly on one claim to a different claim. So in a summary, Medicare paid me for a claim, decided that they shouldn't have paid me for that claim, and eventually moves that money over to a different claim. So let's take a look at an example of how this works in practice. We're going to start out with the assumption that we have two calls that we're going to bill to Medicare. Each of them has an initial balance of $800. So I bill call number 1 to Medicare, and Medicare sends me a remittance file. They send me remittance file number 1. The check amount that's identified in that remittance file is $500. And when I look at the contents of the remittance file or read the paper remittance that I received, it tells me that I was paid for call number 1 a total of $500. Well, it's good because a remittance file has to balance out within itself. So since they sent me a check for $500 and they told me that they paid me $500 on call number 1, that's a good thing. And that payment on call number 1 needs to be applied to call number 1. So my balance on call number 1 is now $300. Now, we're going to step back to terminology again for just a moment before we look at what happens with the next remittance that comes in from Medicare. We'll discuss the FB Provider Level Adjustment Code. The FB code that you see on your paper remittances or in remittance processing stands for forwarding balance. That dollar amount that goes with the forwarding balance code represents a balance moving forward to a future remittance, or it could be a balance being applied from a previous remittance depending on whether it is a positive or negative amount. That definition applies to the HIPAA 5010 specification for remittance files as a whole. In practice, Medicare uses the FB to represent a balance moving forward to a future remittance transaction. So we receive a second remittance file down the line, and for whatever reason, in remittance file number 2, the remittance file says that we are receiving, the check amount was $0, so it was a non-payment remittance. Well, it was a non-payment remittance, but it tells me then when I look at the details that I was paid on call number 1 negative $500. Well, negative $500, that basically means that they took the money away from call number 1 for whatever reason, and there would be claim adjustment reasons explaining why they are taking that money back. You know, they've denied that claim now because it shouldn't have been paid at $500. So at this point, since we have a remittance that says that the payment amount on call number 1 is now a negative $500, billing applies that negative $500 to the call, and the call balance is now $800. Now it's very appropriate at this point for that call balance to be $800. We don't want to delay making that call balance $800 because it may have been denied by Medicare because there is a different primary payer, and if there is a different primary payer, I want to bill that other primary payer. And I want to bill that primary payer for the full call balance, so I need the call balance to be $800 at this point so that I can get payment for this claim as soon as possible from the appropriate payer. Now, as I said when we were looking at remittance number 1, that the remittance file has to balance out. Well, the remittance file has to balance with all the claims that are paid, and right now my remittance amount says that my check amount was 0, but I was paid minus $500. Well, a remittance amount can't be a negative amount, so in remittance processing, something has to be done, or in the remittance file, something has to be done to make that file balance, in which case then we get a forwarding balance. We'll see that in the provider level adjustments. It will be listed as FB with a dollar amount of $500. So that makes my remittance transaction balance out. My check amount was 0, and my forwarding balance, of $500 offsets the negative $500 that was paid on call number 1. Now, it's important to note at this point that the forward balance of $500 is not represented in billing. We had originally in remittance 1 credited $500 to a call, and now we have taken that $500. We are now taking that $500 off of the call. So the call number 1 is back to its original $800 balance. The forward balance of $500 is still in the provider's checking account. But the forward balance of $500 is not the provider's money. That money is a forwarding balance from Medicare of Medicare money that is sitting waiting to be allocated to a future claim in a future remittance file. Again, the forward balance is Medicare's money. And at this point, the forward balance should be considered as an overpayment. Now, before we go on to the third remittance transaction that is part of a recovery from Medicare, we have another term to look at. That term is overpayment recovery. You will have seen that on remittance, paper remittances, and in electronic remittances when you print those or look in remittance processing as provider level adjustment code WO. And that is a provider level adjustment code for the recovery of a previous overpayment. And that is the definition that is in the HIPAA 5010 specification for the WO overpayment recovery code. Key there is that it says it's recovery of a previous overpayment. So let's look at what happens when we receive the third remittance file. The third remittance file comes in, and in this case, again, it says that the check amount is 0. It says, though, that in the claim area that we were paid on call number 2 a total of $500, and when we apply that payment to call number 2, we have a call balance of $300. Once again, since the remittance file has to balance within itself, we can't have a remittance that says that it paid us $500 for a claim with a check amount of 0. And so at that point we see in the provider level adjustment section of the remittance that WO adjustment code, meaning overpayment recovery, of minus $500. So once again, the $500 payment and the minus $500 overpayment recovery balance each other out, and so the check amount of 0 is appropriate within this remittance. It's important to note that remittance number 3 did not take money away from call number 1. Medicare took the money away from call number 1 in remittance 2. This is where Medicare took the money away from call number 1, and at that point you could consider it they gave you a forward balance loan of $500 to hang on to until they owed you money in the future, which they did when they paid you $500 on call 2, but they paid you that out of the forward balance of $500 that you had gotten through the transactions in remittance number 2. I mentioned early on that the forward balance should be considered as an overpayment. Well, the WO overpayment recovery provider level adjustment was used to recover the forward balance. And we have to remember that WO means overpayment recovery. If the forward balance wasn't an overpayment, then the WO code wouldn't have been valid in remittance 3. It would have used the FB code with a negative amount.